Good morning. I'm an expert in climate issues, and I've been working on the disruptions of climate, but also on climate change. But I would like to start by saying a few basic things, because I think that we've been going into details, technical details. What is geoengineering? Well, geoengineering is a wide concept which has huge potential to some extent. But we can say that the greatest experience we've had in terms of geoengineering was to produce CO2 in the atmosphere. I think that this is something which we haven't done willingly, but this is something which is, I would call, a geoengineering experience. It does have negative impact that we can't really control or monitor. Now, having said this, and having defined geoengineering in a very wide way, that is to say, I think that we have to take into account the urgent aspect of all the problems we're faced with when we talk of geoengineering. What happened a few decades ago and at the very onset of the 20th century? Well, we have to look back, and I would like to tell you about Santa Arenus, who was the first climate expert, and he was a Nobel Prize of chemistry in Sweden. And at the beginning of the 20th century, he made a few statements which are astonishing. And he said that the climate disruption was due to CO2, and it would be very dramatic. And he thought that it would be a positive change because the level we had of CO2 at that point in time was not very dramatic. And the changes that could be triggered by the increase of temperatures was a very slow process, and he thought that it would be one of the means to avoid a new icing period. So he thought it would be positive. Of course, he could not imagine that the increase of temperatures, the rise in temperatures would be so dramatic. I think that today we're no longer in this scenario. I think that today, as I said, we're confronted to very urgent problems because there has been a speeding up of all the process. I remember when I was a kid, 1 billion ton of carbon, coal, natural gas was produced. And today it's 10 tons, that is to say, even more than that. If we have in mind the deforestation, that means that we are aggravating most of the problems we've had a few decades ago. So this will affect us even more in the future. That means that we need more readjustments, but we have to speed up all these readjustments. And the speed, which is now prevailing on many other factors, implies that we have to be very drastic when it comes to some of the options we have. For instance, contain the increase of temperatures to 2 degrees. I think that this is something that's going to be very difficult to do because the CO2 we are injecting in the atmosphere stays there and remains in the atmosphere for centuries. So, as I said, this is an urgent situation we're confronted with. Now, what does this imply? What does this mean? What should we do? It's not very easy to measure the urgency of the situation in terms of climate. We have to try to see what this implies at other levels. For instance, we can't believe that we will avoid climatic changes only by containing CO2 productions. That means that by 2040, we would have to be completely carbon neutral and have a drastic drop of CO2. If we don't do that, of course, we're going to have climatic changes which are going to be very serious. But are we going to be able to contain this, as I said before, using sprays, and spraying, as we said, particles in the atmosphere. I think this is very naive, and the planet today is very complex. So it's not so easy to find options which would be rather simple or appear as being simple. I think that we can solve to some extent some of the outbreaks we have, but not most of the problems we're confronted with. So if we monitor temperatures, okay, well, that would be a first important step. But we don't have a complete connection or correlation between the kind of temperature increase or rising that we see today and the cooling that could be obtained through the particles with sprays and the stratosphere. So there is not a balanced correlation between both phenomena, because if we do this, if we have this spray in the stratosphere, this could give way to other disruptions. So what do we have to do if we want to contain the global warming? Well, do things at a very intense level. And I think that this could give way to other threats. And technologies, we have to speak of technologies that we use in terms of climate change, are technologies which do not always take into account the complexity of climate and climate change. We know that we won't be able to imagine what will happen if we continue having an increase of greenhouse gases. We're not able to control completely the process which is taking place and containing all the changes that this is spurring. So I think that there isn't much that can be done. I don't think we have to go further on in terms of scientific research. What we have to do today is act and implement some of the scenarios we already have. So if we want to reach this 2 degrees threshold, well, we already have scenarios for that. And we know that the European Group on Climate has really insisted on the fact that we had to contain temperatures. We know that in the Paris COP21 conference, this will be one of the main aspects discussed by all work parties and countries. Now, this scenario means that by the end of the century, either we will have what we call negative emissions, or we'll have a neutral emission. That means that we'll be able to recapture in the atmosphere what we have produced in the atmosphere. So that is a huge constraint. We have more than billions of cars driving everywhere, and with all the emissions that this implies. So how can we control this? How are we going to be able to control all this huge CO2 production? We're going to have to decarbonate the atmosphere, either with these sprays or capture, sequestration of CO2, and storage of CO2 underground. Now, the problem we have with these technologies is that they're not developed today enough. Therefore, we are in a contradictory situation. If we want to adopt measures enabling us to control temperatures and keep it below the threshold, which is considered as dramatic, then we're going to need specific scenario, but also other technologies which are more active. For instance, sequestration of CO2, capture of CO2, using the techniques we already use in heat-producing power plants using catalysis, and then that means that you store CO2 and we reuse it. We've been doing this. We have prototypes for that, but it's not as convincing as we thought it would be. Therefore, I really believe that we have to act to start with, do something. It's probably dangerous to some extent, but this is something that we have to try to do. Avoid having major risks appearing. And as it stands today, the techniques for carbon sequestrations is one of the goals that we have developed. So if we decide to use this technology, then we have to do that explicitly, but we also have to develop these technologies so as to be able to use them in the future. Thank you very much.